Good morning, and thank you for joining our first ever Executive Council on Infrastructure webcast. I'm Michelle Nellenbach, the Director of Strategic Initiatives here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And a little background on our council. It consists of business leaders who came together to talk about public-private partnerships and how to get more private capital into public infrastructure. It includes such amazing companies as Standard & Poor, American Water, Moelis, Xylem, FedEx Freight, KPMG, and the Bank of Montreal, among others. And the council identified a couple different obstacles to getting private capital into public infrastructure projects. And one of those was how public entities account for their assets. The sense is that private investors need long-term life cycle cost analysis. So the idea there being that when you're going to build a project, know not just how much it costs to construct it, but how much it costs to maintain it over the life of the asset. How that brings us to disasters is the sense that if you were to do those upfront analysis, it would potentially force you into a conversation about, well, what do we do if we are in an area prone to flooding? Well, there's no part of our country that doesn't get hit by a natural disaster of some kind or another. And so it would force you to factor in those potential costs when you're crafting the project, and perhaps look at different ways of building that infrastructure. But there's also a lot of other reforms and ideas out there on how we address this, particularly coming to light after 2017, which, as everyone knows, was a really challenging year in terms of natural disasters. We had hurricanes Irma, Harvey, Maria that hit Houston, the Gulf Coast, and then, of course, everyone knows about Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, who are still struggling. Just last week, the entire grid for the island of Puerto Rico went down, and people are once again without power. And so those are still reminders that we have got to do a better job of addressing these storms. We've also had catastrophic wildfires out west. And interestingly, we had a record number of tornadoes this year, which isn't something that garners quite the same attention as a hurricane, but have huge impacts on those communities. And so part of the BPC's project is to talk with our guests today, but also to look over the next couple of months of how do we foster a sustained conversation about how to build better and also how to budget better. You know, we talk in the immediate aftermath of these storms about, well, now we need to build smarter. Now we need to experiment with different energy approaches. But people just want their water back on and their power back on. So that's not really the time to be having that discussion. It should be a long-term view that we're having now outside the context of any of those natural disasters. So that's what we're doing here today with our wonderful group of esteemed guests who are going to walk us through some of the policy solutions, but also what we're seeing on the ground. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by Carol Ellinger-Haddock. She is the Director of Public Works for the City of Houston, which, as you all know, had saw catastrophic flooding last year. We have Jessica Hogle, who's the Senior Director of Federal Affairs at Pacific Gas and Electric, who've been very involved out in California with the wildfire recovery. Laura Lightbody, who is the Project Director for Flood Prepared Communities program at the Pew Charitable Trust, who's done a lot of great work on not just the programs that help communities, but also the federal budget around this. Oftentimes the aid gets caught up in it's a political football, and members of Congress use it to score political points when in fact there's real people on the ground who need this money. And so we simply need to come up with a better way of funding this than really seemingly catching federal decision makers off guard every time there's a natural disaster. So Laura will talk about some of that today. And finally, online through a Skype interview is Ahmad Wani, who is the CEO and co-founder of One Concern. Ahmad is a survivor of a natural disaster, and from that experience created a company that's designed to help communities address these concerns before the disaster strikes. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to start with Carol. Houston is obviously a very spread out city and has had a history of flooding in the past. But Hurricane Harvey brought 24.5 trillion, is that right? Trillion gallons of rain to Houston. No city really could have been prepared for that. But how had you recovered from previous disasters, and how did that change? Did it change any development decisions? Walk us through what happened.
Okay, so do you want me to walk through the slides that we
Yes,
brought?
why don't we do that? Yep.
Start with that. So I'm going to set the stage a little bit for what Houston is about. Through our struggles and our triumphs, we came through this with a slogan, Houston Strong, and you'll see that hashtag Houston Strong. Many cities do this as they face tragedies, but during the immediate aftermath and recovery that is ongoing, one of the things that we remind ourselves daily is that we must stay strong. So when you look at Houston, this is an impact of the citywide that we had. It's hard to imagine what this is. This is about 650 square miles of city. And the red, the green, the yellow, everything here is an intensity map that shows the properties that were impacted with the storm, the majority of them impacted by flooding. We had 150,000 structures that were impacted during Hurricane Harvey by flooding. There are only about 700,000 structures in the city of Houston. So if you look at that percentage-wise, you know, almost a quarter of the city was impacted. If you look inside the 100 and 500-year floodplains where you're already at a higher risk, we had 30 to 35% of those structures impacted. And if you look outside the floodplains, the startling statistic is 20% of our structures outside the floodplains were also impacted during Harvey. Harvey was not a hurricane for Houston per se. By the time it got to Houston, it was a rainstorm. It was a very, very intense rainstorm, but we did not have wind damage, and we did not suffer many of the things that Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands and even Florida suffered with the power loss. Once the water went down, we were able to get to work and to get going. But when you look at the statistics, it's pretty startling. We were not spared in our infrastructure. And one of the things that happened during the storm, the city of Houston has 39 wastewater treatment plants. We're a very flat community, and we grew by annexation. And so a lot of what we did was take over infrastructure that had been built when it wasn't in the city and came into the city. 18 wastewater treatment plants were impacted. 10 were fully submerged as part of the storm. And we have one wastewater treatment plant that has flooded 3 times in the last 3 years. And so you begin to ask yourself the questions, are these in the right place? Are these where they should be? We also face challenges on the drinking water side. We have 3 surface drinking water purification plants. And all 3 of them had significant flooding on site, but all 3 managed to stay fully operational during the disaster and post-disaster and stay operational today. We did have some challenges. We had some significant challenges during the storm. We had people that were on site 4 days because you couldn't get in and you couldn't get out. They were pretty much stuck there during the event. The one thing we're worried about on the infrastructure side is our latent damages. Both our wastewater system and our storm sewer system were pressurized for 4 days. And these are systems that are not designed to be pressurized. In fact, this area of town where these 2 plants are was pressurized for about 10 to 14 days because these were inundated with reservoir releases, not just immediate rain.
So pressurized means got a significant inflow of...
Right, so basically they were operating in it. Normally they flow 3/4, 80% full. Occasionally they're pressurized for a few minutes when you've got water that's draining out, but in this case, they were literally under pressure for days on end. And what that does is it can actually jostle the joints, and so 2, 3, 6, 8 months down the road, you'll actually see cave-ins and sinkholes where those joints have been knocked loose, but you don't see it until those latent damages show up later down the road. And so those are the things we're watching out for now that can be multi-million-dollar repairs. And that's where you run into those dangers. You see them all around the country, where you may have a street collapse or you may have a sinkhole open up that you just didn't know about. And that's unusual in Houston. We don't have those types of soils. But what this brings us to is a crossroads. Houston has faced these challenges many, many times in the past. As a young hydrologist, I could call the storms by month and year: May and June '89, October '92, October '94. You just knew all the storms. You had studied them, you had modeled them, and everything that's happened in Houston. But we're at a point in time where our population and our leadership are saying enough is enough. This is time for us to look at different ways to be, and that we can't keep expecting our people to endure flooding and recover from flooding. It's time for us to take some steps and begin to avoid flooding. And we're not going to change the rainfall. And we know that these intense tropical storms are going to come our way again. And we also know that climate change is changing our rainfall patterns. And so the question for us is, how do we take a city that is built out and become more resilient? And it's a multi-step process. We found out during Harvey that our current regulations really aren't good enough. We had 13,000 homes, a little less than 13,000 homes that we know the finished floor elevation. We know that they're compliant with all our current criteria, all our current guidelines, and nearly 5,000 of those homes flooded in Harvey. That tells you that something's not going right. That tells you that what you're doing, and we have some of the most stringent flood plain regulations in the country prior to Harvey. We're a no net fill community. We're a community that has freeboard of 1 foot. We have additional freeboard in the floodway. We have lots of things in place. We're actually in the community rating system from FEMA, a Class 5, the largest city in the U.S. at a Class 5. Our residents receive a 25% reduction in flood insurance. I mean, all these things, and yet you look at these statistics and they're very staggering, and they make you stop and think about it. So what we've done, and in fact just in April, earlier this month, City Council in Houston adopted a more stringent floodplain regulation moving forward. This will protect future development and redevelopment in the city. We're going to go, instead of protecting to the 100-year, we're actually going to be protecting to the 500-year storm. It's a less frequent, and some people say too restrictive, but what we know is that our rainfall is changing and that we will have new floodplain maps. And the current 500-year is actually very close to what the soon-to-be adopted Atlas 14 rainfalls will be for the 100-year. And then we went to 2 foot of freeboard. And so this is for prospective. What are we doing moving forward? But what it doesn't do is address what are we doing for the structures that are out there. We have almost 90,000 structures in the 100-year floodplain. We have an equal number in the 500-year. And of those, 80% were built before our first floodplain map was adopted and before our first floodplain rules were in place. And so we have people that are living in harm's way through no fault of their own. And so we have to have other programs in place that help people get out of the way, whether it's through elevating an existing home, whether it's through taking homes that have flooded many times and demoing those homes and rebuilding them to current criteria, and in some cases, whether it's just buying out some areas that are low-lying and not allowing development to happen there again, converting it to green space or parks. But at the end of the day, we have all of those options on the table, and we're willing to move forward with any of them and challenge any of them. For anybody that wants to get more information about what we've done and where we are, we have everything on HoustonRecovers.org. Right. And so we certainly, all the information we've developed, everything that we have is out there, and we encourage people to come check on it and give us input and ask us questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Carol. And for those who might want more information about the floodplain maps, we have a excellent explainer blog on our website at www.bipartisanpolicy.org, which you all know because you're watching the webcast. Anyway, so from flooding to wildfires, Jessica, do you want to tell us a little bit about the weather conditions in California leading up to the fires, how PG&E has been engaging with folks post-fire, and how things are looking in California right now?
Sure. Thanks, Michelle. It's great to be here with everybody, and thanks to the internet world for tuning in this morning. California has recently seen significant climate-driven events. So leading up to 2017, which was our most devastating wildfire season on record, we had 5 years of drought that led to, among other things, tree mortality crisis. So the U.S. Forest Service has estimated over the past 5 years that 129 million trees have died as a result of the tree mortality crisis. We've also seen the length of the wildfire season become longer and the number of total wildfires increase dramatically. So last year, CAL FIRE confronted over 7,000 wildfires compared to an average of 4,800 before that in the preceding 5 years. So on the evening of October 8th, there was in some very low humidity. Prior to that, we had seen a really significant storm season in the spring, followed by a heat wave in the summer where, I think it was Mark Twain that said, "I've never been colder than summer in San Francisco." That was not the case. It was hotter in San Francisco than it was here in Washington, D.C. And then on that night, we had extreme low humidity and high winds, in some cases hurricane force level winds, but no rain. That led to ultimately 21 major wildfires spreading in Northern California, connecting with each other, and just a completely devastating loss of life, homes, and businesses. So that night, throughout the course of the immediate response for PG&E, our focus was on life safety and supporting the work of first responders. So we activated 4 emergency-based camps in the different counties that were impacted and worked to restore gas and electric service as quickly as we could. In some cases, we proactively took gas lines out of service. And really, wanted to return a sense of normalcy as soon as we could, because when people have their power and their gas back, they feel a little more normal than they did before that. So we had almost 360,000 electric customers that went out, over 40,000 natural gas customers. We had to deploy mutual aid assistance crews that came in from 4 other western states. So there was 4,300 employees in total that helped support the response, including some that also lost everything in the fire. Later that year in December, there were significant wildfires that happened in the southern part of the state. In fact, the worst in the state's history with the Thomas Fire. That's outside of PG&E's service area, but I know that our hearts go out to those folks as well. And then after that, as a result of the fire and the devastation that it left behind, where there were significant rains, of course, then you had the mudslides that happened. So it was just a compounding effect of these, literally a perfect storm of extreme weather events coming together. The wildfires in their aftermath have created not only this enormous challenge of rebuilding, and we are going to be there standing shoulder to shoulder with our customers for as long as it takes, but the broader public policy challenge of how are we going to address these risks and change the way we do things to become better resilient, to be able to better prepare, withstand, and respond to these events. So for PG&E, our strategy is grounded in 3 pillars. It's to respond, rebuild, and increase resilience. So for response, we would like to work to support the effectiveness of first responders in both combating and preventing wildfires. So in March, we launched our Community Wildfire Safety Program, which among other things have established for us a Wildfire Safety Operations Center in our headquarters in San Francisco, where we can monitor these risks real time and share information with first responders. We have secured our own firefighting resources at PG&E to be able to support them, but also have them on site when we are doing work on our system that could present a risk, and so we just want to have them there on site and to assist those crews in high fire danger areas. We've also expanded our weather forecasting and modeling through our installing a network of weather stations in our service area. And that allows us to better kind of predict when we're going to see these significant events and pre-place crews so that if something does happen, we can respond quickly. We will also support the fires impacted communities and help them to restore and rebuild as long as it takes. So immediately we instituted credit and billing relief for our customers. We have a dedicated team now, so anyone who's rebuilding has one point of contact at PG&E, and I think anyone can appreciate with some level of bureaucracy having a single point of contact, your person, to help you through the process. And we've supported some charitable organizations such as the North Bay Relief Fund and others at least $3 million, but we've also supported other organizations as well. And finally, we will support the state's efforts to be more resilient to climate change. So, for PG&E, climate resilience means adapting to changing weather patterns in ways that will mitigate potential consequences for our employees, our customers, our assets, our infrastructure and operations. So we have been looking at 6 climate drivers, wildfire being one, rising sea levels, major storm events, increasing temperatures and heat waves, drought, and land subsidence. So since 2013, PG&E has invested $15 billion to harden our infrastructure. Interestingly, for the wildfires, $1.6 billion alone just to manage the 120 million trees that could become hazardous within our rights of way. We have our own meteorology team and our weather network to be able to pre-place crews. As part of our efforts with the DOE Climate Resilience Partnership, in 2016, we conducted a study of all of our climate risks and potential mitigations that we released publicly. And then for the first time with our Public Utility Commission, we actually did a filing with the same kind of similar idea where we identified what our climate risks are and what the mitigations are. And we created a climate resilience tool so that we can kind of screen how this mitigation could impact us, how we can factor that into our decision making, and then ultimately help us make smart investments that are going to be able to withstand to this additional risk. And then I think we're also working to increase resilience within our communities, so not just internally, but externally. We launched the Better Together Resilient Communities Grant Program, which is $1 million over 5 years, 2 grants of $100,000 for projects in disadvantaged communities where they have demonstrable and replicable programs to increase resilience. And that way this grant helps them to do more of that. And then we provided $1 million of shareholder funding for the climate resilience, the California Climate Resilience Challenge. That'll be around the broader climate summit in September, with the kickstart to increase that fund significantly, that again for statewide projects to increase resilience. So those are just a couple of the things that we've been doing.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. I do want to get Laura Lightbody in with the Pew Charitable Trust. Flooding, obviously not a factor in Southern California, right. Certainly though. Huge impacts. A significant part of a lot of our natural disasters, they come with hurricanes and just general flooding that you experience in the Midwestern states. So describe your Flood Prepared Communities program and really why you've decided to focus in on the flooding aspect of all this.
Yeah, so at the Pew Charitable Trust, we've always looked at issues where there's many issues where there's sort of an intersection between fiscal responsibility and environmental stewardship. And when Hurricane Sandy hit, our board looked at each other and said, can Pew make a difference in this space? Can we improve the way that our nation responds to and prepares for natural disasters? In 2015, we launched an initiative called the Flood Prepared Communities project that's aimed at reducing the impact of flood-related disasters on the U.S. taxpayer and the environment. So why flooding? It is the most common and costly natural disaster in the United States. In 2016, 36 of the 46 presidentially declared natural disasters were flood-related. So when states and communities are overwhelmed, they go up to a national disaster declaration. So the majority of disaster declarations that are happening are flood-related. And it's costing billions and billions of dollars. Last year, we're looking at upwards of $300 billion. A lot of that was from Hurricane Harvey. And as you mentioned, every state in the United States is impacted by flooding. Every community is impacted by flooding. Where it rains, it can flood. And we're starting to see more and more places that we don't often think of flooding. We've already seen this year, West Virginia, Missouri. It's happening inland, it's happening coastal, and it's happening more commonly. Unfortunately, the policies and the regulatory environment that we have in place have enabled a lot of the damage and cost that we're seeing as a result of these flood-related events. We have perverse incentives to live in flood risk areas. We subsidize flood insurance rates, and we bail people out in communities and states when they're impacted by flooding, often over and over again. And we've encouraged more and more built infrastructure and not necessarily put a large enough emphasis on the role of nature and the role that nature can play in reducing flood risk. And we just keep putting more and more things in harm's way, right? People want to live near rivers and lakes and the coasts, and we've continued to develop in those areas too. So as these events become more common, we just simply have more assets at risk. So what we've tried to focus on is how do we fix that? We take a macro approach, so it's great to be here with a city and the private sector and Silicon Valley, because what we're really looking at is what is the role that the federal government can play, and how can we improve some of these policies so that we're equipping communities with resources that they need to be better prepared, like Houston, but we're also thinking about, are there bad policies in place that have led to some of these decisions, a lot of which are old policies that have been in place for a very long time. The National Flood Insurance Program was created in the 60s. FEMA just turned 40. So taking a fresh look at some of these policies at a time when our understanding of risk is much more sophisticated than it used to be. We can look into the future now, and we're going to hear some of that from Ahmed with One Concern. We can look into the future now to understand where are problem areas going to be, where is it going to flood, likely going to flood again. And that's not just flooding, right? That's fire, that's all these natural hazards that we're seeing more and more commonly. And there's a big impact on infrastructure. A lot of our critical assets are located in flood-prone areas. So when it floods in a community, it's not just that people, which is devastating, right? It's not just that people are displaced out of their homes. All of the pieces of a community, whether it's a utility or a school or a hospital that support communities and keep them going, may be down, right? So we have to really make better decisions about where we're going to locate these things. Maybe it doesn't make sense in the future to be building schools or hospitals or utilities or airports in the floodplain, in areas that we know are really risky. So we're really taking a macro lens at this, a macro approach of how we can improve our federal policies. There's a lot of discussion this year about infrastructure and what Congress is going to do about it. And so we really have an eye towards, can we think about resilient infrastructure? Can we incorporate future risk into those decisions? And can we think about the role that the built environment plays, but also the natural environment? So maybe I'll just leave it at that, and we can talk a little bit more about some of that.
That'd be great, and actually a really good, thank you for laying the groundwork for Ahmed, who again, thank you so much for joining us at 11 o'clock at night where you are. As Laura had mentioned, a lot of this we know a little bit more about where the risks lie and where disasters might have the biggest impact. Talk to us a little bit about One Concern.
Okay, do you guys have the slides up, or I can just speak without the slides as well, whatever. So to sum up, One Concern's mission is planetary scale resilience, much of what you guys have been discussing, and it's such an honor to be here and learn about all these disasters as you've experienced them firsthand. So at One Concern, we are basically an AI technology for natural disasters, and we take a broad view of natural disaster, of resilience, all the way from chronic stressors like poverty and economic inequity, all the way to shocks like earthquakes, floods, and wildfires. And we're really working at the intersection, trying to help decision makers make the most risk-informed decisions before, during, or after these disasters in order to minimize their disruption. A very quick background of sort of how we got started. I think it's the next slide. Uh, so one concern, I'm an earthquake engineer by training, and I was been doing this from the past decade because my hometown Kashmir was struck by an earthquake in 2005, killing 70,000 people, and I came to Stanford University to do my master's and PhD, and between that, I went back home to get engaged to Kashmir, and this was August of 2014. The day I reached, basically the very next morning at 3 a.m., there was a flood. At 3 a.m., basically within 15 minutes, I think dozens of embankments broke, and within 15 minutes, 3 floors of our house were underwater, and me and my family were up to waist height in water, and we were in that situation for 7 days, waiting for response. So it was very shocking. It was just sudden, and we were, our neighbors had a 4-storied house, so they were throwing food at us, and that's how we survived. And many people, we were seeing dead bodies floating with the water because houses had started collapsing on the 4th and the 5th day. But there were all these helicopters going over our heads all these days. So on the 7th day, the water came down, and we walked to safety, and we were lucky our home did not collapse. But I started wondering, like, how do these helicopters make decisions on who needs to be rescued? They just randomly go wherever they want, and there doesn't seem to be any science behind disaster response. And when I sort of double clicked on it, I found that they call it the lack of situational awareness. Basically, it's just basically lack of data. And if you think about it, Facebook at this point knows what I'm going to eat tomorrow and next year this day, but we don't know the size of somebody's house or the soil under somebody's building, and because of that, we are allowing so many people to be affected because of natural disasters globally. And so we at Stanford started to work on trying to understand what are these problems, why cannot we collect all this data. And so we focused on so 3 specific problems. Could you go to the next slide, please? So as a part of my research there, along with a few of my other research colleagues, what we were able to do was gather all the data, whether it is the built environment, every detail of every house in the United States, or it is the natural environment, or it is the live data coming in, whether it's social feeds, sensors, and whatnot. But we understood sort of early on that it's not just basically the density of the data which is important, but it's also the dynamicity of the data, because it's continuously changing. Cities like Houston are continuously expanding, and so are the other cities on the east, in the developing world. And so there needs to be a method through which we are continuously updating this data. And even during a flood, if 2 rivers suddenly combine or a tree falls into the river, the hydrogeology of the river suddenly changes, and your model is out of the window. So you need to have a way to continuously update. And so it was the density and the dynamicity which AI came to the rescue. So we started to use artificial intelligence in our and combine that with hazard sciences, and basically we were able to capture on a very granular resolution with high certainty what would be the impact because of a natural disaster. And if you guys go to the next slide, you can see some of that. So this is a simulation in San Francisco. So within 15 minutes after the earthquake, you would be able to see whose house will be in what level of damage with 8 on 10 times accuracy. And then with live data coming in, this would grow more and more accurate. Now, the same simulations could be used before the event, and you could run an ensemble of hundreds and thousands of simulations. And then, since the data is dynamic and the machine learning can basically make hundreds and thousands of changes live, you can be able to say, hey, what if I actually changed all the two-storied wooden buildings to, make them slightly stronger. What would that mean for the resilience of the city? What would that mean for, our food deserts if we made an investment in this bridge here or in this flood wall there? So you're able to capture a data-driven approach, or basically have a data-driven approach to some of your policies and some of the infrastructure dollars which the city was already spending. And we later realized that this problem is multi-hazard. It's not just one hazard. And so if you go to the next slide, we were able to run analyses on the Houston event. Again, we very similar situation like earthquakes, wherein dynamicity and of the data and the density of data was really critical. And if you run a regular 500-year event, most of the areas would be out of the as Carol was mentioning, they would be out of the impact zone. And we were able to get more than an 85% accuracy, 25 hours or 26 hours ahead of the event, just because of the live dynamic nature of the AI platform, which is self-learning. But now, if you go to the next slide, you could use the same platform to be able to say, hey, if I dropped 5,000 sandbags right there, 26 hours ahead of time, what would be the before and after impact, and who would be now less affected? So, and you could do the same thing for hundreds of other active mitigation changes, whether it's a flood barrier or a wrapping system or any of these combinations. And because it's a dynamic model, you can do hundreds of what-if simulations and really protect and engineer the flood and protect the critical infrastructure, as also mentioned by Carol, whether it's water facilities or chemical facilities, which can otherwise have cascading implications. So really, what we've kind of learned from our work with cities in the West, as well as here internationally, is that we really need to focus on of course, the data aspect, wherein we really want to have dense data regarding the built environment, most updated dynamic data regarding the same, but then also map the dependencies between these different data sets, because most of these critical infrastructure can have second order and third order effects. So really, what should you, if you have $100 as a policymaker, should you upgrade the city hall across the street, or should you should you give the seismic ordinance, or should you elevate everybody to a 500-year event and 2 feet above that, or should you buy a new fire truck? What makes the most sense in terms of saving the most lives or saving the most livelihoods, or whatever the metric for success for the city looks like? And usually these are city-specific things, and so you need to be able to work with the city to be able to make these to help them make these decisions. The other aspect of our work, which has been kind of interesting recently, has been public-private partnerships and developing resilience networks, because we disasters don't just affect governments. Disasters affect communities, and so it's important to engage with the business community at the same time. So financial institutions and private corporations, and they have vested interests in the city being resilient. And so devising models through which you can actually show a return on investment of being resilient, of building a flood wall, and how does it impact a food store or a grocery store there, basically makes them a stakeholder, or as much a stakeholder, and basically helps us scale resilience. So I guess I'll stop there, and then we can discuss the details and questions.
Well, great. Thank you so much. That was incredibly informative. And to your latter point, I do think the private sector could be a really strong advocate in a number of these areas. We did a Facebook Live interview with former Governor Haley Barbour, who was obviously governor of Mississippi during Katrina, who engaged heavily with the private sector and was able to get a lot of their communities up and running quickly, to something that someone had said earlier about the schools and getting kids back to normalcy. So that was really the key in this, is that people want to know that their kids have a school and that they have a home. And so I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities there. But you had talked a lot about mitigation, and we've discussed it some. I want to go back to one of our earlier slides. Am I going to get there, Carolyn, or did I go the wrong way? Thank you. Because obviously Houston did a lot in terms of after Harvey, as Carol had said, you changed some of your zoning laws and changed the approach to development a little bit. But some of this is going to require additional funding. And so, Laura, do you want to talk a little bit about the pre-disaster mitigation spending and why we need to be investing more upfront, and what we're seeing is a decline in really those resources?
Yeah, and I think a common theme throughout everyone's remarks has been we need to be more prepared. And being more prepared simply costs more money. And at the at all levels, at the community level, I'm sure, and Carol could attest to this, at the state level and at the federal level, we simply have not invested enough money on the front end. We're really good at paying for disasters after they happen. Congress in the last few supplementals gave about $130 billion for these 3 hurricanes that impacted lots of states last year. Over a 10-year period, we have underinvested in mitigation, right? Paying for and investing in things that make communities more prepared. And you can see from the slide on the screen how much there's actually been a decline in spending. And that tracks very closely to how much money Congress has provided for funding these programs. There's very few federal programs that are actually available to communities before disasters happen. Whether it's a fire or a flood or a tornado or a snowstorm, the majority of the money comes after, which we need for recovery and response, but that's also not really the time to be thinking about how can we really prepare our communities for the long run, right? So we would like to see more of that investment on the front end. We know that it pays off. There's research that shows that every $1 invested from federal grants pays off about $6. That's higher when it comes to flood. So it makes sense from a federal perspective and from a community perspective to be spending this money up front. When you ask voters about it, it makes sense, right? Why would we not be investing and building things right the first time? We did see in this last budget cycle in FY18, we did see a plus up from Congress, which was a great signal from the administration and Congress that they do see the value of mitigation. They do appreciate that return on investment. We saw the biggest appropriations to programs like FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation program that we've seen in at least 15 years, maybe ever. So that's great, but it doesn't stop there, and we need to continue to see those numbers increase.
And we've gotten quite a few questions from folks online, so thank you for that. And along the lines of the money, I don't know if you or Ahmed have some sense for this, but do we have any idea how much money could have been saved if we had just done a little prep work done some of the mitigation work ahead of time? I doubt that's easy to quantify.
I think in this, if we're talking about this most recent hurricane season, it's probably too early to know. We have seen a lot of communities that have made major investments. Missouri, for example, has done a lot in terms of buying out properties that have flooded over and over again. And they've seen that investment quadruple in terms of avoided losses, right? So they've gone to areas that have flooded, bought out those properties, left that space to open green space, and it's then flooded again, and they've seen that return in avoided losses because you didn't have assets and property impacted. We saw that in Florida. There has been some early analysis done on the building codes that Florida has, which are very strong. And they saw the buildings that had the highest codes and were built most recently to the highest codes had the least impact from the floods and wind in Florida. So we're seeing that community by community, and I'm sure as time goes on, we'll begin to see more of that from all these states that were impacted in 2017.
We do have some stats
Okay.
on Houston. So we had about, just in flood insurance payouts, we had about $2.5 billion that was paid out to 25,000 structures. And we know that if they had been elevated to the code that we adopted that will go into effect in September, that we would have avoided nearly 90% of those claims.
Wow.
And even if they had just met today's building codes, we would have been up at 70% would have been avoided.
Wow.
And so that pre-disaster mitigation is a very significant payback. And that's only 25,000. We had 150,000 people impacted.
But how do you get them the resources ahead of time? Like, where is that money coming from to have them elevate their homes?
And that's where I mean, if you look at this chart, that's where that money has gone out of the process. You know, these were homes that were built without the knowledge of today's knowledge of floodplain maps and today's regulations. And so you know, homes last more than 10 years. Many of these homes were built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and you know, they flooded multiple times, but only a little bit. Not enough to be substantially damaged, not enough to require rebuilding. And so it's a cycle that just repeats itself over and over and over. And you know, we do have numbers that show that getting them out of harm's way, and in our case, elevating an existing home is not necessarily the best option, but it's the only one that the federal programs, the benefit cost works. In our case, it's a $250,000 home that we're spending $400,000 to elevate, when we could demo that home and build a $250,000 home that was compliant, and that would be cheaper.
But I think you, and I mean, Ahmed could speak to this more, but I think the importance of everything you all have said is that there was an alignment on the data set, right? So you had these new flood maps that were very instructive about what the risk actually is. And I think even in California, so we just had new fire maps that came out, new hazard maps, where we will be able to do extra work in those areas that are higher risk than others. And the state has already instructed the governmental entities, I want everyone, you know, plan to 2 degrees warming, and what happens, what does that look like? But having that foundation and alignment on, okay, this is the data set that we all agree is real and that we're going to work to is critical.
And we didn't have that in 2001. We had a tropical storm Allison where we had
Right.
80,000 structures flooded, and we did not have this data set. We didn't have the finished floor elevations. We didn't have the information to make these informed updates to our building codes back then.
So to your point, though, Jessica, are you seeing, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not all that in the weeds, if you will, on wildfires, but are we seeing the same areas burn multiple times in California? Or is it, like, was the area that was impacted this time impacted previously?
I think that there were some parts of the area where
Okay.
there was overlap, and I think, you know, in Southern California, the same would be true as well. I mean, you have the Mount Diablo winds where we are, I think the Santa Ana winds down where they are. You know, I think generally in housing, I will say that, or in California, housing is a challenge, right? So even before the crisis that we had, there was a housing crisis that was already existed. So it's going to be something that the state is going to have to tackle in terms of the rebuilding and addressing kind of the 2 birds with 1 stone, if you will.
Ahmed, just to get you in here a little bit, so obviously your tool can predict some of this for us and really help decision makers. There will never be enough money. We know that, but we can certainly set priorities better by identifying, as Jessica said, the areas that might be impacted by the fire next time.
Right. So I think, first of all, if you have to, like in a place like Houston or any other place, you want to do a set of changes. You want to create a recovery plan. Hey, we want to do A, B, C, D, E. And this could be one sequence or one set of plans, which has certain buyouts, certain elevations, build a flood, a flood wall, other things. That builds up your resilience metrics to some number, and those metrics could be improvements in how many people will have less inundation, how many people, low-income people, will have ABC. But then being able to sort of compare 100 such plans and 100 such permutations and combinations in order to be able to get the best value of the taxpayer dollar, taking into account the exacerbation of some of these risks is what we've been kind of working with cities on. So that is one thing, and that is pretty clear that, I mean, we've kind of demonstrated that multiple times that we can do that. The thing is, first of all, if there is a way to So in my opinion, probably this is a an edge case, but we need to also be able to demonstrate to policymakers that this is not just you, because disasters are both geospatially and temporally improbable, and so they need to make a case to their citizens that, hey, we're not forgetting that there is mold growing in the schools. We're not forgetting that there's no water coming, in the so there are these chronic stressors which the cities are faced with on a daily basis, and so they have to somehow balance out how do we actually put these dollars, as you were pointing out, in these large infrastructure projects ahead of time, and how do we make a case and compare them to some of these chronic stresses which the city is already faced with, and whether it's all the way from crime to other things. So that we've kind of tried to bring that angle as well, wherein we are trying to help them compare their overall city resilience metrics and look at it from a broader perspective of safety, of equity, and of sustainability. So that's one thing which we've been kind of doing. I think the other thing is, when you ask like where does the money come from, one of the experiments which we have been kind of trying in a city right now, and is ongoing, is you have to have that public-private partnership approach. And so, for example, if you have an insurance company and a government agency, both stakeholders on the table, now if the government agency is making better decisions on the infrastructure dollars which they are already spending, but now they're spending it in a more risk-informed way, the insurance company's portfolio is getting de-risked. And now the insurance company can give cheaper insurance based on those changes made by the city. And they gain because now more people can afford insurance. And now FEMA cannot come and bail out everybody. And this has been, FEMA stands from time to time. So this has to come full circle, wherein the publicly elected officials can go in and say, hey, we actually made all these changes because this will result in cheaper insurance, whether it's fire insurance or whether it's flood insurance 2 years down the line for the city. And so having that connection, which connects data, policy together and gets all these stakeholders on a single platform, so that they get incentivized, and then they can incentivize the common public, is kind of where I see the money can come from, and actually help us sort of look broadly and make changes ahead of time.
That's really helpful, because I do think, based on some conversations we've had with some former governors who are part of VPC and others, and is that once the immediate crisis passed, it's very hard to keep the public focused on paying for these things when, as to your point, they have schools to build and they have all kinds of other budget pressures. So this data that you can provide shows what the long-term risks are, and can really help to justify for state and local officials who want to invest in these things but have a hard time making that case once the immediate crisis has passed. We are coming up on our hour mark, and we did get one question from the folks online about the federal infrastructure package. And so I wanted to touch base with all of you one more time. With what can state or federal decision makers help to advance some of the upfront resiliency work that we've all agreed is so critical to reducing costs in the long run?
So I'll jump in. One of the creative things that we're doing in Texas right now, we have a large rainy day fund. And so the state is actually using that as a backstop for our state agency to give low and no interest loans that we're working with FEMA to say, okay, if we're eligible for grants in 2, 3, 4 years, can we use the low and no interest loans now from the state, start implementing projects up front, and get reimbursed when the federal money makes it through its grant programs and gets on the ground sooner. And so that's a creative way to get it on the ground sooner, and not having to go through the process of changing. Normally for us, from when a disaster is declared to when the money is available beyond individual homeowners, but to cities and counties to implement, is anywhere from 18 months to 5 years before we see that money.
Wow.
It's not immediate. I mean, debris removal is immediate, but infrastructure and the other resiliency projects are years down the road. And so if you want to strike that opportunity where people are willing to do something a little bit different in the immediate aftermath, you have to have that money on the ground immediately.
Wow, okay, that's helpful. Well, not the federal policy, but Jessica, do you want to touch on a little bit of what's going on with the state and some of the changes that you'd be interested in seeing?
Sure. I mean, I'll say at the federal level, as it relates to the wildfire risk, you know, the disaster relief funding is huge. Now it's a matter of getting it out the door. There were some reforms around vegetation management included in the omnibus package that is going to make our work easier as we, you know, go above and beyond what we've been doing to address those risks. And then lifting the budget cap so that the U.S. Forest Service is adequately resourced to be able to do the mitigation and suppression, whereas before, you know, they were basically borrowing from the mitigation account to do the suppression. So those at the federal level have been extremely helpful. At the state level, I think to what Laura was saying earlier, you know, we have to look at kind of the problem comprehensively and holistically, because there are so many factors here. There's the wildlife-urban interface, there is building codes, there's fire mapping, there's insurance. You know, some of these folks that now live in a fire-prone area, they may not be able to get access to insurance. For utilities, one issue that we are grappling with, while the investigation as to the cause of those wildfires is still underway, California has a concept called inverse condemnation, which is basically like eminent domain after the fact. And California is unique in its applied strict liability regardless of fault, and they've applied it to private entities. So with the idea that if there is damage related to an asset that has served the broader public, then the broader public should pay for that damage. The breakdown that we are seeing in California is that our Public Utility Commission is actually not allowing us to pass through costs. And we're also now seeing the cost of disasters in the tens of billions of dollars, which we wouldn't want to pass on to our customers anyway either. So I think the liability doctrine in California could be modernized in addition to looking at kind of what are the other operational changes that we should make, what should homeowners be thinking about as they rebuild and other issues.
Thank you. And what is Pew pushing or suggesting that the federal decision makers might want to change to any of these programs, really?
Well, as we look towards an infrastructure package, you know, I think members of Congress in all states are looking for creative ideas so that they are sort of understanding the value of mitigation, that all, you know, at this point, every member of Congress, if they've been in for 10 years, has had a federal disaster happen in their state, right? So there is sort of an understanding that we need to look towards the future. So how does that apply to roads? How does that apply to the Department of Transportation? How does that apply to housing? So how does that apply to HUD? So we're really looking at this from a comprehensive sort of holistic approach, so that if we're gonna put a large investment into infrastructure, we're paying for it once and we're doing it right once so that it's there for next generations.
Great. Ahmed, did you have any other comments on the federal policy landscape?
I think whatever the three panelists pretty much sums up, you know, we need to factor in resilience, and if there is any movement on that, and we need to invest the limited federal and the private sector dollars in the best possible way and to mitigate disasters beforehand.
Great. Well, thank you all. This was really informative. I know we probably could have spent an hour with each of you and still had more to cover. And thank you to all of our online viewers. Appreciate y'all going experimenting with us a little bit on this webcast. And as I mentioned, this was part of our Executive Council on Infrastructure, and the Council is going to continue to explore these issues related to resilient infrastructure and what changes we might need at the federal and state and even local levels to incentivize smarter building up front, as opposed to just having this conversation in the immediate aftermath of a disaster when really the priority needs to be to getting assistance to those folks on the ground. So keep an eye on our website and Twitter feed and all that for more information on our natural disaster work. And this webcast will live live on the website for the immediate future. Thank you all very much.